Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. And we are at the beginning of the 2042 to 2043 off season, likely to be an off season of transition for the Buffalo Wings. Although we won the National League East this past year for the 10th time in the past 11 seasons, we ended up falling in the NLCS to the Atlanta Braves in our effort to repeat as World Series champions. Ended in a seventh game of the NLCS. Atlanta went on to be swept 4-0 by the eventual world champion Cleveland Guardians. As I mentioned, it's likely to be an off-season of transition for our team. You can see we've got a number of open spots throughout our organization through coaches who have retired. Big loss of pitching talent as we've lost our AAA, AA, High A, and DSL rookie ball pitching coaches, as well as a couple of hitting coaches at the major league level in the DSL level. So that will be a focus shortly. And we're also going to have some pretty significant players headed to free agency. Starting pitcher Alexis Mendoza, who's grown up in our organization. Left fielder Juan Romero. All he's done in 4 years in Buffalo is lead our teams in ribbies 4 consecutive years. Darnell Polite, who we brought on as a rental as we got close to the trade deadline. And our starting catcher, Mitch Houlihan, and backup catcher, Walt Miller, as well as our stopper, Nate Ruckel, are all potentially headed to free agency, along with some other players that are less important than those gentlemen. So going to be a lot of interesting decisions for us to make this offseason. We've got about $18 million to potentially spend, and we certainly could move scouting and player development budget down a bit from the levels that they were at. We'll do that right now, just in the interest of giving ourselves a little bit extra financial flexibility as the off-season begins. Positively, our market size did increase to average with the off-season beginning. We've had great support from the fans in Buffalo ever since we started this journey 20 years ago, game time. And in our 17 seasons as a major league team, we just broke the all-time record with a 15th consecutive playoff appearance after missing the playoffs each of our first 2 seasons as the general manager of Buffalo. And stepping into the manager's office for a bit, you can see those first 2 seasons, 26 and 27, after we started in the majors, followed by a long history of pretty good success here. It's kind of interesting. When we make it to the World Series, we've won each time. We're 3-0 in the World Series. The issue is that we're not that good in the NLCS. With the loss in the NLCS this past season, we've now lost 5 times in the NLCS over the years, so a 3-5 record in the NLCS is not particularly inspiring, but at least the 3 times that we have gotten out of the National League, we have gone on to win it all. And when all was said and done, the regular season was pretty solid for the Buffalo Wings. 99 wins, right in line with Pythagorean expectations. We did incredibly against left-handed pitching, good against right-handed pitching. We had over 600 winning percentages the first 5 months of the season, but September and October, just a 13-16 record in the final month plus of the regular season. After falling down 2-0 to the Padres in the NLDS, we did win 3 in a row to get to the NLCS. But unfortunately, as we've already discussed, we fell in 7 games there to the Braves, and our season was over. We ended up generally a middle-of-the-pack team in most of the offensive categories, and given that, as I've talked about, the guy who's led our team in ribbies 4 consecutive years and home runs 3 of the last 4 years headed to free agency is not necessarily optimal for us. As we have often featured over the last 10 plus years, pitching staff, one of the best in the National League, one of the best in baseball. When all was said and done, we were in the top 2 in every category in the National League for pitching, except for BABIP, where we ranked 7th. Pretty good defensive team as well, and pretty good in stolen bases as well, where Deshaun Seifu won his 15th consecutive National League stolen base title. Turning to our annual review of the players as we start trying to figure out what this team should look like next year. Alexis Barajas, our ace, the Iron Man, is now 34 years old. Signed for another 2 seasons at $20 million before a player option for him at the age of 36 at that $20 million level. 16-6 this year, 3.25 ERA. He has been an excellent pitcher for us over the years. 176-93 record over his major league career, and with Buffalo, he's now 134-60 with a 3.18 ERA. 2.96 SIERA over the course of his career in Buffalo, 37 WAR over his close to decade in the Buffalo Wings uniform at this point. So that was a trade with Miami where we gave up a lot, but felt we really needed to bring him on to head our rotation, and he's done a great job of that for close to a decade. He's not necessarily, one of the top 3 or 4 pitchers in baseball, but he has consistently been a top 10 or so starter in baseball over the course of his tenure in Buffalo. Jim Lance just completed his 2nd full season in the majors, 11-7 record, 3.75 ERA, 1 strikeout per inning. He is still set to make the major league minimum next year, which will be helpful given some of the players that we'll be losing and the ability to use the money that we have available in free agency to supplement our team. Looking forward to what the 24-year-old will be able to do next year as a 25-year-old. Still think he's got the ability to improve some of his pitches a bit. Throws in the high 90s. Should be a big part of our rotation for many years to come. Floyd Auclair picked him up in a trade with Toronto before the season started. Has an incredible arsenal of pitches. The concerns are his control is not that good, and his stamina is not that good. And we did kind of see indications of both of those things this year. But the end result was still excellent. 11-7 record, 2.85 ERA, 12.3 strikeouts per 9 innings. He did walk 83 batters in those 154 2/3 innings pitched. And you can see he wasn't even on average a 5-inning pitcher for us, which does diminish the number of wins he's potentially in line for. But still think that he can be a very important part of our rotation going forward. He is now arbitration eligible, so set to make a little over $5 million next year, most likely. But he should be back with us because Alexis Mendoza will probably be leaving. A guy who's come up through our farm system, 15-9 with a 3.60 ERA this past year. He's been a 2nd or 3rd starter for us over most of his career. Had a nice run for us in Buffalo. Can see a 76-55 record over the 6 seasons he's been with us. 3.48 ERA, almost a 24 WAR over those 6 seasons. But he's fragile. He's going to be turning 30 years old next year. And he's also looking for $22.8 million over a season, as well as a 10-year contract with some player opt-outs and some player options that will take him into his late 30s. Given the depth we have in our farm system and the fact that we are going to be a little short on money and probably more likely to spend that money to bolster our offense and our everyday players than our pitching staff, I think it's very likely that Mendoza will be gone next year. We will likely give him a qualifying offer, and if he accepts it, it's certainly not the worst thing in the world. but at the very least, we should get some decent draft pick compensation when he moves on. And Eric Barbarito, with the likely departure of Mendoza, will likely be moving up in the rotation. First round pick from almost a decade ago. 10-7 is our fifth starter this year with a 3.45 ERA. He has been pretty good ever since he came up. Those first 2 years, he struggled when he was not a regular starter, although 2039, we did give him a lot of opportunities. But the last 3 years, 31 starts a year, each season is a fourth or fifth starter for us. ERAs in the 2s and 3s, and as a fourth or fifth starter, feel real comfortable having a guy like Barbarito in that role. Starting to get expensive for what he is. Arbitration estimate over $8 million. So with the youngsters that we have coming up behind him, it's conceivable that Barbarito could, a couple years from now, be following Alexis Mendoza to free agency rather than paying him a lot of money to buy out his free agent years, but for the time being, still likely to be an important member of our pitching staff and more specifically, our rotation. Joe Scott has had 5 years. Wow, time flies. 5 really nice years for us in Buffalo as our closer. 8-7 record this year with 44 saves, well over a strikeout per inning. The 3.11 ERA was the highest of his career, but his SIERA was 2.60. So think that he is still a pretty darn good relief pitcher. He is heading into his final arbitration eligible year, expected to make around $9 million. We like what he's done for us as a closer, 4-time All-Star, couple Mariano Rivera awards, so he will likely be back with us next year. The question is how much he's looking for if we try to get him locked up for the long term. 7-year deal, he's looking for about $14.5 million a year. Some teams can afford that for a closer. I don't know if Buffalo is one of them. Think it's probably likely we'll sign him to an arbitration number this year, let him play out the season, and then decide how to proceed a year from now. Guys who we don't have a year to figure things out include Nate Ruckel, soon to turn 35. He has done an outstanding job for us the last 4 years, ever since he took over as our stopper. Led the league in games each year, led the league in holds 3 of the 4 seasons. Only 129 1/3 innings pitched this past season, and his ERA went up to 4.18. Some of the secondary numbers were still pretty strong, though. The issue is, at 35 years old, he's looking for $10 million a year over 4 years. As much as we appreciate what he's done and as good as he's been for us as a high-volume stopper, he may be getting a little bit expensive for the Buffalo Wings to afford. Speaking of guys we probably can't afford, we mentioned that Darnell Polite joined us right before the trade deadline. 5-0 with a couple of saves, 4.72 ERA, which isn't so great, but 43 strikeouts and 34 1/3 innings, which is pretty good. He's also headed to free agency, looking for $13.5 million a year, so pretty unlikely that Polite will be back. We've already exercised our team option to bring the 32-year-old David Rivera back at a reasonable $1.4 million next year. Had a really nice year for us, 2-1 record, 3 saves, 82 strikeouts, and a 2.02 ERA over 66 2/3 innings pitched. So with the potential departures of Ruckel and Polite, it's very conceivable that Mr. Rivera will be having a bigger role in the bullpen next year. Chris Powers, another right-hander that we picked up in the Rule 5 draft before this season. 5-1 record, 2.57 ERA over 49 innings pitched. A guy who could start in a pinch, Iron Man as far as his injury proneness, and he's still set to make the major league minimum as he made his major league debut with us this year. 28, turning 29 years old. Don't know how a guy with his skill set never really got a fair shake in the Dodgers organization, but we will be glad to have him as a member of the bullpen next year. Sean Drawn, a left-hander who we picked up on waivers from the Dodgers 2 seasons ago, has had a couple of nice years with us. 2.53 ERA over 53 and a third innings this year. Left-hander out of the bullpen who's a bit more effective against lefties than righties, particularly since we could be moving on from the lefty stopper Nate Ruckel. Drawn likely to be an important pitcher for us next year. Pat Cheek, picked him up in a trade with Texas a couple years ago, spent most of last year in Albany, but all of this year with the big club, 3.40 ERA over 50 and a third innings pitched. Another guy with the repertoire to start in a pinch if we needed, and only set to make about $1.5 million in arbitration next year, so Cheek likely to be back with us. Mike Roberts, a guy we picked out of Coastal Carolina in the 7th round, probably going to get a full-time spot in the major leagues next year. He's been good in Albany, very good in Albany, quite honestly, over the last 2.5 years. Has had trouble breaking into our bullpen, but he did a good job in 11 innings when he was up at the end of the year. And with the pending departures of likely Mendoza, certainly Polite, and quite possibly Ruckel, that should open up a spot for Roberts on the pitching staff next year. Similarly, Simeon Minelli, international free agent signing from 2037, was incredible in Albany this year. 16-3 record, 2.43 ERA, and he won the IL Outstanding Pitcher Award this year. Came up and was not great in 9 1/3 innings pitched, but a small sample size. Minelli, not incredible stamina, but he does have a 4-pitch arsenal, and he could certainly be in the mix to be a 5th starter for us next year when we move on from Mendoza. David Espinoza, the left-hander who would have been our 5th starter this year if we hadn't made that trade for Eau Claire right before the season started, is a guy that probably nearing the end of his tenure with us, but with the departure of Alexis Mendoza and the departure of the left-handed stopper out of the bullpen, the left-hander who can start or relieve for us and is probably going to be making close to $6 million next year will probably be back. 3.24 ERA over 72 1/3 innings pitched this year. Getting expensive at around $6 million for a guy that we're going to likely be using out of the bullpen, although he could be in the mix to be a 5th starter. But as a effective lefty with really good stamina, who even if he isn't in the rotation, could start for us if we have some injuries, probably a guy that we will also be inclined to bring back. So feel pretty good about the pitching staff. It was an excellent pitching staff this past season, as we've talked about, and even with the likely departures of Mendoza and Polite and the very possible departure of Ruckel, feel that we've got a lot of quality depth still on this team, and could always add talent in the Rule 5 and or free agency to bolster the players who will be coming back. And with the review of our pitching staff complete, we will turn to our position players. And this is an area we're expecting significantly more turnover and change this upcoming offseason. Some of it will be because players are headed to free agency. Some of it will be because players are headed to big arbitration numbers. And some of it will be because I just think we need to improve some areas of this team. Catcher, as we alluded to earlier, is an area where there could be very significant turnover. Mitch Houlihan is headed to free agency. Finally was healthy for the playoffs this year, and the 322 at-bats he had this season and 97 games he played in were both career highs. This is a guy who is a 307 career hitter over close to 1,500 major league at-bats. His 280 average this past year was the lowest of his career. His 92 WRC plus was the first time he was not an above average offensive player. Still put up a 2 WAR on the season, as he does have good defense, but he's fragile in terms of his injury proneness. He's turning 30 in about a month and a half. And he's looking for 3 years at about $11.6 million. So we could conceivably bring him back at that kind of level. I don't know that it's the right decision, but it's not such an exorbitant number that it's not at least something to think about. My inclination is, given that he's going to be turning 30 and given that he has been injury prone over the course of his career, we probably move on from him. But the fact that he's one of the few left-handed hitters that we've had in our lineup over the last couple of years works in his favor. Walt Miller is a guy who was with us for our second World Championship in 2036 and now our third in 2041. In between, he spent a few seasons in Colorado. Back as our backup catcher this year, put up a 110 WRC plus, helped by 11 homers and 204 at-bats. Pretty solid defensively at this point in his career. He is 34 years old now. He's a guy who's at times struggled to keep the batting average over 200 in the majors at times. For his career, he's a 235 hitter and a slightly above average offensive player. And he's looking for 3 years at about $9 million. So I like the fact that he's healthier than Houlihan. Like the fact that he's solid defensively like Houlihan. But given the money he's looking for, it's not all that far off of what Houlihan's looking for. It seems like both of these guys view themselves as starting major league catchers at this point. If we were to go with one of them, I think Houlihan is probably the one that we'd be leaning towards. So I think it's almost certain that Miller will be gone. And they could both be gone if we decide to just give the job to Juan Ramirez. We signed him as a free agent this past offseason out of Cuba. He's the number 90 prospect in baseball. Excellent defensive catcher. The question is how much he's going to hit. Put up a 114 WRC plus in AA Utica and a 152 WRC plus in AAA Albany. But he really struggled as a 24-year-old in 51 major league at-bats, hitting just a $157 for us. Didn't end up making the postseason roster. We went with the veterans Houlihan and Miller. But we really like the defense of Ramirez, really like his durability. And even though we had to pay up a bit to bring him on board, that $4.5 million number is what he'd be back at next year, which is a fraction of what we would be paying to either Houlihan or Miller. So we'll have to make some decisions as far as the catchers. I think my inclination is probably to just turn the job over to Ramirez. I am concerned that he's going to struggle to hit 200 in the majors, similar to what we've seen with Walt Miller over the years. But with his good defense and his durability and his ability to draw some walks, we can probably overlook that. I do think a platoon of Houlihan and Ramirez could be very effective. Just don't know if we're going to have the money to do that. Turning to our infielders, Eric Horst, first baseman who's come up through our system after being a third-round pick in 2036, spent the whole year in the majors this year, but only 67 at-bats. He was a bench guy for us, turned 25 during the season. Does have a little bit of speed, although he played so infrequently, he only had the opportunity to steal 2 out of 2 bases this year. A useful-ish bat, I think, although he did put up only a 68 WRC plus in that limited sample size. Probably a guy who, given that he can play first, second, or left for us, will be in the mix to be the 24th, 25th, 26th man on our roster the next year or two, but don't see him being a big part of the future of our organization. Daniel Rojas, on the other hand, is, although he's 36, still a very important part of our organization. The big free agent signing from 2 years ago now has 2 years at $30 million a year left on his contract. Has hit 60 homers over his 2 years with us, 91 and 92 ribbies, put up a 126 WRC plus when all was said and done this year. He's basically done about what we expected he would do with us, tied for the team lead in homers this year, even though that number was only 24. He is not a great offensive player, but he is a very good offensive player and a guy who can hit some home runs, who has been important for us in the middle of our lineup, even though somewhat strangely for a guy who has hit 60 home runs in the regular season over the past couple of years, in 97 postseason at-bats for us over the past 2 seasons. Not a home run yet. Does have 7 doubles, and he's driven in 10 runs, but only a 258 hitter and only a 110 WRC plus in the playoffs for us. So he has not been as good in the postseason as he has been in the regular season. So moving on from our first baseman, we've got a plethora of good, solid, but not great middle infielders who will be in the mix to be on the roster next year. Alejandro Contreras, who we traded for almost 3 years ago. Exactly 3 years ago, we made the trade for Alejandro Contreras. He was with us through the whole year in the majors this year, hit 241 with 28 doubles and 10 homers and 377 at-bats, put up a 96 WRC plus, a 1.6 WAR. He's a guy with a decent bat who can play decent defensively at a number of infield positions, very versatile. 26, closing in on 27 years old. We think he's still got untapped potential, but given his age and his low adaptability and low work ethic, question whether he's ever going to reach that potential. That said, with the fact that he's been up and down for much of his 3 years with us between the minors and the majors, still set to make the major league minimum next year, hard to imagine that he won't be on the roster, and certainly would expect him to be in the mix to be playing second, short, or third for us. Mike Whitehead, a similar guy who's come up through our organization, another guy who can play a lot of positions in the infield, has some more positive personality traits. Don't think his bat is quite as good as Contreras. He dipped to a 75 WRC plus this year, 345 at-bats, hit 261, 10 doubles, 4 homers, so not a lot of extra base power with him. Barely a little less than a win above replacement. Another guy who is still making the major league minimum, though, will be 25 at the start of next season. So similar to Contreras, hard to imagine he won't be on the roster, but question whether or not he'll have an everyday role, particularly against both right and left-handed pitching. Either or both of those players could find themselves in a platoon situation. Mike Frank is a guy who we picked up in a trade with the Mets a year ago, turned 25 after the season ended, spent the entire year in AAA Albany, where he put up a 104 WRC plus, did have 27 homers, although he hit just 246. Another guy with a bat that's not horrible, but not special either. Not much speed, but he is a guy that when he spent this past year in AAA, we ensured that he got trained up at first base and second base. So although we certainly would not want to play him at second base on a regular basis, and he's really more of a natural first baseman or third baseman, he does have the versatility to play 3 out of the 4 infield positions, and he could also catch for us in a pinch. Don't think he's ever going to be anything but a backup, but with his versatility defensively, his high work ethic, and the fact that he's not a total automatic out, could see him being in the competition to be on the roster for the next several years, at least while he's making the major league minimum. And last, but probably not least, among those middle infielders is Jim Andrews. Picked him up in a trade with Boston 2 years ago yesterday. He's been our starting shortstop the last couple seasons. 247 average this year, but did have 24 doubles, 12 homers, and a surprising 80 ribbies, given that he was batting near the end of the order most of the season, particularly against right-handed pitching. Put up an 83 WRC plus, but a WAR of almost 2, as he's probably the most well-rounded defensive infielder we have. A lot of positive personality traits. Not a Gold Glove caliber shortstop, but he's not a bad defensive shortstop either. And another guy whose bat is competent. Another guy who's also set to make the major league minimum next year. So the interesting thing about all four of these middle infielders is they're, with the exception of Frank, Contreras, Whitehead, and Andrews are likely to be going into their years when they're making above the major league minimum about a similar time. So the potential costs of these players are going to get more significant over the next year or two. But with the fact that for next year they're all major league minimum guys, certainly should be in the mix for playing time and roster spots. The question is really whether we want to add a more established middle infielder with perhaps a better bat in free agency or through trade to supplement these guys who, as I talked about, are all good, cost-effective, decent major league players, but by and large, nothing special. And with all of the other infielders discussed, we now turn to the living legend, Deshaun Seifu, who in the history of Buffalo sports is up there with the Jim Kellys and Josh Allens and Pat LaFontaines and Gil Perot's and Dominic Hasek's and Bruce Smith's of the world as one of the most popular and accomplished athletes in Buffalo sports history. Deshaun Seifu, now 38 years old, still an Iron Man as far as his injury proneness, still excellent speed, and he did lead the National League in steals for a 15th straight year this year. His defense at this point is only average, and quite honestly, he's at a point in his career where third base is even a stretch for him to be playing. He probably deserves to be a first baseman or a designated hitter. Doesn't really have any competency to play in the outfield. It's conceivable that because of his bat and his speed, we'll keep him at third base next year, and with the versatility and defensive quality of a lot of those other infielders we just talked about, maybe have him be a guy that we take out of the lineup in the late innings. But he is at this point just 79 hits away from the 3,000 hit club. As we talked about, he's led the NL in steals 15 consecutive years. Every year that he's spent a full year in the majors, he's not only led the league in steals, but helped lead the Buffalo Wings to the playoffs. 1,221 stolen bases over the course of his career. So I think that puts him 183 away from Rickey Henderson. So it's not inconceivable that he could still catch Rickey Henderson for the most stolen bases in baseball history. Had a bit of a resurgent year this season. His 107 WRC plus was his best since 2037, a bit below his 111 career mark. His 286 batting average was also his highest since 2037, when he hit 300 for the last of 5 consecutive seasons. 3.7 WAR on the year, as his defense is getting less exceptional. He did win a couple of, to me, surprising Gold Glove awards very early in his career, in his first 2 full seasons in the majors. But it's been well over a decade since he won a Gold Glove at this point. 82.8 career WAR, so unlikely that he will get to 100 career WAR, but 3,000 career hits is not far away. And if he plays another 3 to 4 seasons, there's still a chance that he could catch Ricky, which seems incredible to me. The big decision we're going to have with Mr. Seifu, we've got a team option for next year at $16 million, and then a team option for 14 after that. But we noted at the end of our last episode that when we were looking to offer him a contract extension, he was only looking for 3 years at $7.333 million a year. Now, granted, those are years that kick in after the $16 and $14 million years. But given that we're going to be making a lot of changes this offseason, is it possible that declining this team option for $16 million and trying to re-sign Mr. Seifu for less is the right play? We want him in a Buffalo uniform next year, even though his contact and his gap power have been declining and he's not the player he used to be. Cannot envision him getting his 3,000th hit for any other team. So if we do decline the option, we're going to do everything in our power to bring him back. But despite the respect we have for him, he's getting to the point in his career where he may need to take a little less money. You can see that he's only been an all-star 4 times over the course of his career, despite the fact that he's led the league in at-bats, runs, hits, doubles, and triples all multiple times, as well as those stolen bases we've talked about, and even winning a batting title over the course of his career. So the game doesn't tend to put a big dollar number on the type of player that he's been, and he doesn't tend to win a ton of awards. Given that his contact and his gap power have regressed and that his defense has regressed, I do think there's a chance that we could get him back with a contract with some options for us for less money than he's set to make next year, because just given his overall profile and his age, I don't think the game loves him in terms of awards and salary dollars as perhaps I do. But we'll talk more about what could happen with Seifu at the end of this episode. Before we get to that discussion, going to take a look at all of our outfielders. Bobby Bolig is a guy who was a very important player for us in our first 2 World Series championships. Traded him away to Colorado years ago when he started to make more money. He was a free agent this year who we ended up signing to a minor league contract. Brought him up close to the trade deadline when we made our only trade for Polite. And although he hit only .223 with us, he did have 13 homers in 184 at-bats, so he still was able to put up a 113 WRC plus in the regular season. Felt that left-handed bat with some speed, he was 13 of 13 on the base paths, even though he's 35 years old, was a useful combination for us to add to our offense. That said, it's hard to imagine he's going to be back with us next year. He's still looking for 4 years at $14 million a year. He was looking for, I believe, around $13 million when this offseason started, and no one gave it to him. So it's conceivable that he's going to linger on the free agent market for a while, and maybe he's someone we'll reunite with 4 or 5 months from now at a very discounted level if he's still out there. But hard to imagine that he's going to be high on our initial list of people to think about in free agency. Juan Romero, who we picked up in a trade with Atlanta 4 years ago today, is the real interesting decision to me of the players that are heading for free agency. His batting ratings don't jump off the charts. Defensively, he doesn't jump off the charts. Speed-wise, he doesn't jump off the charts, but he is an Iron Man as far as his injury proneness. He's grown into a captain personality. And as I talked about earlier, in 4 years with Buffalo, all he has done is lead the Wings in runs batted in for 4 consecutive years. And his first 3 seasons with the team, when he hit 35, 33, and 41 homers, he led the team in homers each year. Did dip to 22 homers this year, but still put up a 115 WRC plus. A very useful offensive player who we know is going to be out there every day. The issue is he's looking for 8 years and close to $20 million a year, and he's now 30 years old. I think his best years are probably behind him. I think the 4 years we had with him are probably going to go down as 4 of the best years in his career. He did put up some good WRC pluses his first 2 years with Atlanta, but he hit for a lot more power once he matured a bit and came to Buffalo. Would love to have him back. It's just a matter of whether or not the numbers actually work. Willard Vokey is a guy who we picked up right before the start of this season, spent most of the year in AAA Albany where he was dominant, 273 average, 44 homers, 118 ribbies, and a 125 WRC plus. He was 1 for 7 in a very small sample size over 5 games at the major league level. Not very good defensively, not much speed, but a guy who potentially has plus contact, plus home run power, and is durable. Probably in the mix for the next couple years to be a backup infielder / backup outfielder / pinch hitter for us, but probably not a big part of our future. In contrast, Ishmael Velasco better be a big part of our future because we signed him to a long-term extension last offseason after he won the Rookie of the Year award and the World Series MVP award for us. Had a bit of a down year this year compared to his brilliant rookie year when he put up a 147 WRC plus. We weren't really expecting him to continue producing at that rate. The WRC plus dipped to 114 this year, but he still had 35 doubles, 5 triples, 15 homers, scored 79 runs, drove in 86, 20 of 22 on the base paths, and when all was said and done, put up a 3.9 WAR. He's a good defensive center fielder, a fan favorite with a lot of positive personality traits in the clubhouse, and he's also durable. Would expect him to be our center fielder for years to come. And the last 2 postseason series that we've won, the 2041 World Series and the 2042 NLDS, Mr. Velasco has been the MVP of both of those playoff series, so he's also good in the clutch. Edgar Canales, a left-handed hitting 24-year-old international free agent signing from 2035, spent the entire year at AAA Albany, 291, 20 homers, 61 ribbies, 113 WRC plus. Really nothing left for him to prove in AAA, and he's out of option years at this point. He'll be 25 in March. Solid defensively, has a little bit of speed, can play competent at any position in the outfield plus first base, given that we've generally been a bit light on left-handed bats the last few years. Tend to think he's a very strong contender to make the roster next year. The question is whether he'll be coming off the bench as a 4th outfielder or perhaps finding himself in a situation where he'll be starting against right-handed pitching. What ultimately happens with Juan Ramiro and Bobby Bolig will probably go a long way to determining whether Canales gets a shot as a starter next year or as a bench guy. One guy who we know will be in the lineup is Luis Comadran. Picked him up 2.5 years ago in a trade with San Francisco. We signed him as a free agent after last season, although He's going to make $17 million this upcoming year and then have a player opt out. Pretty much had another vintage Coma Duran season this year. 276 average, 29 doubles, 4 triples, 24 homers. Drove in 80 runs, put up a 142 WRC plus and a 4.9 WAR. Competent defensively, but a really good bat. Durable as far as his injury proneness, and he at this point is the best left-handed bat we have, and he is very proficient against right-handed pitching. So honestly, he's really kind of a platoon player for us, but he plays against right-handed pitching, which still means he's going to likely start 125 to 135 games a year for us. And last and perhaps most perplexing is Josh Porter, and he's going to be a real interesting decision for us. 29 years old, a right-handed hitter, durable as far as his injury proneness, good speed, good range in the outfield, and a hitting profile that is attractive. The issue is that his productivity this year was not good. Hit 230, 17 homers in 453 at-bats. For the year, put up a 96 WRC plus, so he was a below-average offensive player when all was said and done. Was 20 of 23 on the base paths. His BABIP of only 293 was over 50 points down from a year ago, so would hope that there would be some positive reversion towards the mean for him next year. The arbitration number is not horrible, probably going to be 5.2, 5.3 million when all is said and done. He is a guy who can play against both left and right-handed pitching. On paper, he's better against left-handed pitching a bit, with a bit more gap power against lefties than he has against righties. But he is a guy who can play every day. It's just that when we look at what he's done for us, the years that he's played more often than not, 2040 and 2042, he's put up 119 and 96 WRC pluses. Last year, when we were playing him primarily against left-handed pitching, he put up a 138 WRC plus. So he will probably be back with us next year, particularly if we end up needing to move on from Mr. Romero. The question with Porter is kind of similar to some of the questions we brought up with the likes of Canales and some of those middle infielders. Is Porter going to be an everyday outfielder for us, or is he only going to play against left-handed pitching? But given the likelihood that Bolig and Romero will be gone, I think it's very conceivable that Porter will be back with us next year. That we'll still have another arbitration year after that. I have a hard time believing that we'll be looking to sign Porter to a big free agent contract, but if the numbers are not incredibly high the next couple years, we'll probably continue to give him a shot. He's a guy whose skill set to some degree looks better than what he's actually produced. But you can argue that I'm being a bit unfair to him because over the 3 years with us, he has put up an 8.2 WAR, over 3 WARs. His first 2 years with us dipped a little bit this year with his poor batting performance. But I think looking at his profile and looking at his speed, he's better than a 230 hitter. And with that 350 career BABIP, that dipped all the way to 293 this year, I think there's a strong argument to be made that perhaps he just got very unlucky. And with the review of our everyday players done, would appreciate any thoughts you have on which directions we should or should not head this off season. On our next episode, we're going to take a look at our minor league system, some of our former players and former prospects, before we start moving on with the off season. But before we finish up this episode, it's time to make a decision on Deshaun Seifu. I asked for viewers' thoughts on whether or not we should consider opting out of the contract, given what his go forward demands look like. And got two contrasting opinions from two friends of the channel whose opinions I respect. YMe943 suggested declining the option and rolling the dice and seeing if we can get him back for less. Stanley Rosella suggested being loyal to the ultimate Buffalo Wing and not taking the risk of perhaps angering him or losing him or needing to spend more on him. As I said, I respect both of their opinions. I think in this case, just in the terms of trying to do something different and trying to learn something, we are going to decline the option. I talked about the fact that his defense has gotten worse, his contact and his gap power are lower, and just judging by the fact he's only a four-time All-Star despite a career that should end up in the Hall of Fame, I think his skill set and his ratings and his traits and the way they all add up are not necessarily valued as much by this game as perhaps they should be. It's also an opportunity to learn something. It's kind of a weird situation where you've got a guy with two team options at pretty big money for what he is for 2 years in a row, who's looking for a 3-year extension well into his 40s after that. So I think it's also something that I like to do at the channel at times, and maybe share some information by doing something different to help you in the games that you happen to be playing. I tend to think we'll be able to get him signed for less than $16 million for next year. I tend to think we'll be able to get him on a deal with some team options. And given that we are losing or potentially losing a lot of important players and we don't have an exceptional amount of money to use this offseason, and we do want to remain competitive, we're going to roll the dice, move on, and try to learn something new here. So I am going to decline the option on Mr. Seifu and then immediately engage with him as far as an extension, assuming that he's still willing to talk to us, which I think he will be. Deshaun has never impressed me as a man who carries a grudge or a man who doesn't understand business. So I think we'll likely be able to re-sign him or attempt to re-sign him for a pretty reasonable amount that will help the financial situation of the Buffalo Wings going forward. But there's no guarantees. But we are going to void that last contract year, and that now means that we have made the living legend a potential free agent. So let's find out whether we're going to regret that decision or not. Engaging with Deshaun about a contract extension, and he's still looking for 3 years at $7.333 million a year. So turns out that will likely be a very good move. He wants a player option for the third season. I think we'll probably be able to get some team options in there instead. I'm going to work on that offline for a moment or two and come back and let you know what I think the initial offer to the new Fordham Flash should be. And we're going to try to be aggressive with Deshaun Seifu. The Yankees were aggressive with Derek Jeter at the end of his career, and as great as Deshaun Seifu has been, he's no Derek Jeter, although he's probably more beloved in Buffalo than just about any athlete in Buffalo's history, as we were talking. But as I talk about this, I do need to keep in mind that this is all imaginary. Make sure that I'm rooted in reality here. but we are offering him just 18 million over the next 3 years with team options for the second and third seasons, $600,000 buyouts. We're still promising him his role in the starting lineup, but 1.33 million a year less for each of those 3 years than he wanted, and team options in the second and third seasons rather than the player option he wanted for the third season. There's no trade clause, although he does have 5 and 10 rights, so he doesn't really need to ask for a no trade clause now, does he? I don't think this is so offensive that he's gonna cut off negotiations with us. You can see his mood is pretty good here. So we're gonna ask him for a response on this, and he's actually willing to think about it. So this could end up being a really big move for us, because although we had structured the last 5-year contract that we signed with him with the 3 guaranteed years that ended this year at 18 million, and then those 16 and 14 million dollar options that we just voided, the opportunity to save about 10 million, or exactly $10 million on him next year. I guess it's not really technically exactly, because we did just have to pay him the buyout for for declining the team option. We did have a buyout associated with that. But going forward, $6 million next year, so saves us $10 million compared to what we would have been paying him. And if we bring him back in 2044, it would save us $8 million compared to what we would have been paying him if he had been under that other contract. So we will happily submit that offer to Mr. Seifu for 3 years, $18 million. And hopefully we'll have Seifu locked up. You can see that potentially increased our total money available a bit. Not a full 10 million because of the buyout, but still putting ourselves in a more advantageous financial position than we would have been otherwise. So pretty excited that we can bring back Seifu for a 18th season with the Buffalo Wings at an amount that is very commensurate with what he brings to the table at this point in terms of his weaker defensive skills and his weaker ability to get on base than he had when he was in the prime of his career. And with that decision not resolved, because he hasn't signed with us yet, but the decision made, and now we will wait and see what happens. We will call it an episode. As I mentioned, next time around, we're going to check in on some of our top prospects, check in on some of our former players, hopefully have some thoughts from the viewers to react to as far as what we might want to do in this off season. And then in the episode after our next one, we're going to start playing through the off season. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.